The first thing One Move God Mode does is dare you to laugh at its hero, and then it punishes you, almost instantly, for ever taking that dare, because it opens on this quiet, dirt under the nails kind of life where the world is small, the sky is big, and Ethan is even smaller inside his own skin, not because he's weak in the way fantasy protagonists are weak, for 5 minutes before the montage kicks in, but because he's been trained to believe he's nothing, trained so thoroughly that even his posture looks like an apology, and that's what hooked me, not the promise of gods and trials and Olympus, but the raw, uncomfortable realism of humiliation, the kind that settles into your bones when everyone around you benefits from you thinking you deserve less, and if that sounds heavy for a movie with God Mode in the title, that's exactly why it works, because it uses that gamer lingo power fantasy as a mask, then slips a blade underneath it and starts asking why we crave power in the first place, why we cheer when someone finally snaps, and why it feels like justice when the universe finally stops being fair to the people who've been getting away with everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now, One Move God Mode arrived in 2026 with the kind of premise that sounds simple on paper. Farm boy enters a night trial with a rusty pitchfork, gets mocked, awakens divine power, becomes a legend, heads to Olympus, but the execution is what surprised me, because it's not rushing to the fireworks, it's patient enough to make you live in the mud first, to make the trash label sting before it ever gets flipped into a crown, and the movie is very aware of the modern appetite for underdog stories that skip the under part and go straight to the dog, so it slows down in the early stretch and lets Ethan's life feel repetitive on purpose, the same chores, the same tired hands, the same meals that look like they are made from whatever the earth was willing to spare, and the same voices in his environment telling him he should be grateful for scraps. The world building is delivered in a surprisingly grounded way. Instead of front-loading lore dumps about Olympians and bloodlines, it gives you the social texture first. There's a rigid hierarchy. Nobles move through marketplaces like they own the air, and commoners keep their eyes down not out of respect, but out of survival, and in that setting Ethan isn't just poor, he's positioned as disposable. You can feel the movie's anger simmering under the surface in the way it frames those early interactions. Ethan is often shot from slightly above, making him look smaller, boxed in by door frames and fence posts and the geometry of other people's power, while the nobles are given the kind of visual space that says they are allowed to take up room in the world. And then there's the pitchfork, this rusty, unimpressive farm tool that the film treats with a strange, almost reverent patience, like it's waiting for you to notice it the way you might notice an old sky you stopped asking about. It's not flashy, it's not mystical at first glance, it's just there, leaning against a wall, dragged through soil, used to lift hay, and because the film refuses to wink at you too hard early on, the eventual reveal hits with the satisfying clarity of hindsight. Of course it was never just a pitchfork, of course the thing he's been using to survive is the thing he'll use to become something else. The release year context matters here too, because by 2026 audiences have been drenched in chosen one narratives, deconstructions, reconstructions, cynical parodies, sincere throwbacks, and One Move God Mode manages to stand out by leaning into sincerity without becoming naive. It's not embarrassed of Mythic scale, but it's also not blind to the ugliness of the society it's depicting, and that combination gives it a strange emotional torque. The story overview, kept spoiler-controlled, basically follows Ethan as he's pushed, nudged, and finally cornered into joining a night trial, the kind of public gauntlet designed to separate worthy men from unworthy boys, except in this kingdom it's also entertainment, propaganda, and a sorting machine for class power, because even the idea of merit is owned by the people who already have everything. Ethan enters for reasons that are both personal and painfully universal. He wants out, he wants dignity, and he wants proof to himself more than anyone, that the narrative written on his back isn't the only one available. But he doesn't walk in with a legendary sword, he walks in with that rusty pitchfork, which instantly becomes a social crime. The film makes you feel how the room changes when he shows it, how laughter spreads like spilled wine, and how the nobles don't just mock him for being under-equipped, they mock him for daring to stand on the same floor as them. It's a humiliation sequence that could have been played for cheap catharsis later, but it's staged with a kind of cruel detail. The camera lingers on smiles that are too practiced, on the way the crowd's laughter comes in waves, on the little micro-expressions of people who want to look away but don't, because they've learned that empathy is dangerous in a world like this. And Ethan, importantly, doesn't respond with instant swagger. He swallows it, and you can see him trying to fold himself even smaller, trying to survive the moment the way he's survived every other moment, and that's where the film quietly sets its trap, because when the one move finally happens, it's not just a power-up, it's a psychological break, refusal to keep agreeing with the lie. Character-wise, Ethan is written with a careful contradiction. He's capable in the ways that matter on a farm, endurance, patience, problem-solving with limited tools, but socially he's been made clumsy, hesitant, almost allergic to his own needs, and that makes his eventual shift feel earned rather than programmed. He's not an empty avatar, he's a person whose self-image has been colonized. The supporting cast revolves around archetypes you recognize: noble antagonists, trial overseers, fellow aspirants who range from kindly to opportunistic, but the film's best choice is that it doesn't ask you to memorize names and crests as if this is a political thriller. Instead, it uses each character as a pressure point on Ethan's identity, and you start to see that the villains aren't just individual bullies, they are the social system wearing human faces. There's usually a moment in these stories where the hero gets their first win and the soundtrack tells you, okay, we're in the empowerment arc now, and One Move God Mode does that too, but with a twist in the emotional flavor. The empowerment arrives with a dark undertone, like the film wants you to cheer and then immediately question what you're cheering for. When Ethan finally acts, when the pitchfork stops being a joke and becomes an axis around which the air itself seems to turn, the movie doesn't treat it like a clean superhero reveal, it treats it like nature waking up. The godlike power isn't just light beams, it's weight, pressure, the sense of a tide arriving whether anyone consented or not. Without diving into specific late plot spoilers, the awakening of his divine heritage is framed less as a gift and more as a truth that has been waiting, and the truth doesn't care about court etiquette. And that is where the Poseidon connection becomes more than a fun mythological name drop. Ethan being the son of Poseidon isn't used merely to justify cool water effects, it becomes the thematic backbone, because Poseidon in myth is not a gentle father figure handing out blessings. Poseidon is force, mood, depth, the sea as both provider and destroyer, and Ethan's journey mirrors that duality. He starts as someone who feeds the world quietly, like a river that waters crops, and then he becomes something the world fears, like a storm tide that does not negotiate. The film's cinematic language leans into that. You'll notice the way sound changes around Ethan as his power stirs, the crowd noise dulls, like you're going underwater, and you start hearing the low, ominous pulse of something ancient. Visually, the action scenes are shot with a clarity that I appreciate, especially in an era where epic sometimes means incomprehensible, and while there are definitely moments of heightened stylization, slow-motion impacts, exaggerated ripples of force, the geography of the fights usually stays readable, which makes the big moments feel like consequences instead of random spectacle. The pitchfork itself becomes the film's best visual metaphor. It's a humble tool that, once revealed as the hidden trident, ties Ethan's two identities together rather than replacing one with the other. That matters, because a lesser version of this story would treat the farm life as an embarrassing prologue to be erased, but here it feels like the farm is the forge. Every time Ethan grips that weapon, you're meant to remember it has been in the dirt, it has been used to lift burdens, it has been part of survival, and now it's part of judgment. The trash to legend arc, then, doesn't land as a fantasy of becoming someone else, it lands as a fantasy of the world finally seeing what was always there, and the emotional punch comes from realizing how many people in real life never get that moment, never get the cosmic reveal that proves everyone wrong. That's why the humiliation hits so hard, and why the retaliation, yes, retaliation, not just victory, feels so complicated. One of the most striking things about the film is how it handles the nobles. They are not nuanced in the maybe they are secretly good way, but they are accurate in the way entitlement behaves when threatened. First they laugh, then they deny, then they bargain, then they panic, and finally they try to rewrite the story so they can still be on top even as the world shifts. The film gets a lot of mileage out of the idea that power doesn't always recognize itself as violence. The nobles genuinely believe they are the natural order. Ethan's existence in their arena is treated like an insult, and when he pushes back, it's treated like a crime. That's not subtle, but it's honest, and in 2026, with audiences more literate than ever in the language of systemic inequality, that honesty resonates. Now, let's talk about that central promise in the title, One Move God Mode, because it sounds like the movie is going to be pure instant gratification, like a meme turned into a plot, and in a way it is, but the one move isn't just a combat technique, it's the single decision to stop agreeing with your assigned place. The film builds to a moment where Ethan's action is both small and enormous. It's small because it can be described in a sentence: he makes a move, he refuses to be humiliated into silence. It's enormous because everything around him was built to prevent that refusal. And the film sells it by making you feel the cost of that move, not just the physical danger of standing up to trained knights and armed nobles, but the psychological terror of stepping outside the identity you've been forced to wear. When Ethan's power erupts, it's catharsis, yes, but it's also grief for the years stolen, for the version of himself that learned to shrink, for the simple life that might have been enough if the world had been less cruel. That blend of catharsis and grief is the movie's secret weapon, and it's what turns the midsection from fun escalation into something closer to mythic tragedy, even when the scenes are cheering you on. Performance-wise, speaking generally, without getting into specific casting since the film itself is what we're judging, the actor playing Ethan carries the film with a face that can look empty in the early scenes in a way that reads like dissociation rather than boredom, and then, as the story turns, that emptiness becomes a canvas for something frighteningly calm. And I love that the film doesn't make Ethan instantly quippy when he gains power. He doesn't become a stand-up comedian with lightning. He becomes quieter. There's a stillness that arrives, like the eye of a storm, and the people around him mistake that stillness for weakness until they realize it's restraint. That's an important distinction, because it frames Ethan's power not as a toy, but as responsibility, even if he's not fully ready to carry it. The pacing is interesting. The first act is slow by modern standards, and I can already hear the impatient viewer saying, "Get to the God stuff," but if you give it that time, the payoff is stronger, because when the God stuff arrives, it's not just special effects, it's narrative justice. The second act is where the movie becomes addictive, because it turns the trial into a pressure cooker. Every challenge isn't just, can Ethan win, but how long can the world keep pretending he shouldn't be here? The film cleverly uses public spectacle as a storytelling device. The trial is not only a physical contest, it's a theater of class. People bet, gossip, and perform morality. And Ethan, initially, is just another act, until he becomes the show that breaks the stage. Cinematically, the movie loves water imagery, but not in the obvious, pretty way. Water is shown as labor, hauling buckets, irrigating fields, before it's shown as divinity. Then, when Ethan's heritage awakens, water becomes a language, ripples that respond to emotion, condensation gathering like the air itself is listening, a sense that the sea is present even inland, like a memory embedded in the world. And then there's the weapon reveal. When the pitchfork is understood as Poseidon's hidden trident, it's not treated like a twist for twist's sake. It's treated like a recontextualization of everything Ethan has been doing. The same tool that turned soil now turns fate. That's myth-making 101, and it works because it's simple. The film doesn't ask you to memorize a prophecy. It asks you to look at a rusty thing and realize it was sacred all along. The emotional analysis really comes down to this: one move God mode understands humiliation as a kind of slow violence. Ethan's enemies don't only want to beat him, they want to define him. They want him to internalize their laughter so thoroughly that he never tries again. And when the movie gives Ethan his power, it's not just saying, he can fight now, it's saying, he can define himself now. That's why the fights feel personal even when they are huge. There's a particular satisfaction in watching a character who has been pushed into the dirt finally make the dirt rise with him. But the film also flirts with a dangerous fantasy, the idea that the only cure for oppression is overwhelming force. It doesn't fully interrogate that, but it hints at it in the way Ethan's power scares even the people who empathize with him. There's a subtle shift in the crowd's energy from laughter to awe to fear, and that's real. People love an underdog until the underdog becomes a threat to the entire structure. The movie seems aware of that hypocrisy, and it uses it to keep the tone from becoming too glossy. When Ethan crushes his enemies, the word crush is emotionally accurate. This isn't a series of friendly duels. It's domination. And the film's direction makes that domination feel both satisfying and unsettling, because it's filmed with the grandeur of a legend being born, but the sound design and the reactions remind you that legends are often terrifying when you're standing too close. The themes are classic but effective: identity, inheritance, self-worth, class oppression, the lies parents and societies tell their children, and the moment you decide whether you'll live inside those lies forever. Ethan has been tricked into thinking he's worthless, and that trick is more than manipulation, it's a strategy. If he believes it, nobody has to chain him. He'll chain himself. The film treats that as the central villainy, and the nobles are just the most visible expression of it. Poseidon's presence, meanwhile, operates like a counter-myth. If the world says you're nothing, the sea says you're made of ancient storms. But the film doesn't present heritage as a cheat code, it presents it as a responsibility you don't get to refuse once it's awake. And that leads to the Olympus angle, which is where the movie expands from local revenge story to mythic road story. Without spoiling the exact final beats, the narrative naturally pivots toward a larger destination. Olympus isn't just a place, it's the idea of confronting the source, the origin of the hierarchy that trickles down into the mortal world. When Ethan sets off for Olympus, it doesn't feel like a victory lap, it feels like the first step into a war he didn't ask for. And that's the right note to end on, because it keeps the legend alive in your imagination. You don't walk away thinking, okay, he solved everything. You walk away thinking, he just became a problem for the gods. And that's delicious. Now, on the craft side, the movie's best sequences are the ones that treat action as emotion. When Ethan moves, the choreography isn't just cool spins, it communicates a transformation in self-perception. Early on, Ethan's movement is defensive, apologetic, like he's trying not to take up space. Later, the same body moves like it's claiming the world. Even if you don't consciously notice it, you feel it. That's good filmmaking. The score, again, speaking generally, leans into a blend of earthy, percussive textures in the farm scenes and then swells into something more choral and tidal as the divine elements come forward, and when it works, it creates this sense that Ethan's life is being watched by something older than humanity. That's the cinematic version of myth. There are a couple pacing issues, though, and I want to be honest about them. The middle escalation is so satisfying that the film occasionally rushes past the emotional cleanup. There are moments where Ethan's relationships with other contestants or allies could have been deepened. The movie is so laser-focused on the humiliation to ascendance pipeline that it sometimes treats side characters as stepping stones rather than people. That may not bother you if you're here for the power fantasy, but if you're here for character drama, you might notice that certain bonds are implied more than they are lived. Also, the political dimension, how the kingdom reacts institutionally to Ethan's emergence, could have been explored with more complexity. We get the vibe of panic and denial, but the mechanics of power shifting are mostly background texture. That said, I can also argue that this is intentional, because the film wants the experience to feel like a legend being told, and legends don't always stop to explain the paperwork. It's more interested in the emotional truth than the procedural truth. Audience reaction-wise, One Move God Mode feels engineered to become a conversation piece, especially online, because it delivers those screenshot moments, Ethan standing with that pitchfork, the crowd laughing, the sudden silence, the turn, the impossible force, that are practically designed to be clipped and shared with captions like, they didn't know who he was, and in 2026 that kind of viral readability matters. But what makes it stick beyond the clips is that people recognize the emotion underneath. Most viewers have felt underestimated. Many have felt humiliated. Not everyone gets to become a demigod in response, but the fantasy is not just about winning, it's about being seen. That's why this movie has the potential for cultural impact within the fantasy action space. It's tapping into a shared anger at systems that reward cruelty and call it tradition. It also taps into the modern appetite for mythological remixing. We've seen Greek myth reinterpreted in 1,000 tones, camp, prestige, horror, romance, and One Move God Mode chooses something like blue-collar myth. It's Poseidon through the lens of labor, inheritance, and resentment. And it's not subtle about making Olympus feel less like a paradise and more like a boardroom of immortal privilege waiting to be challenged. If this becomes a series or spawns sequels, it's because the ending naturally opens the map. Ethan's story is only beginning when he points himself toward the gods. And that's another reason the film works, it doesn't pretend the first awakening solves the deeper wound. It treats power as step 1, not step 10. The emotional core remains, what do you do after the moment you stop being worthless? How do you rebuild a self after years of being told you don't deserve one? The movie gives you the rush. But it also leaves you with a question, and I love when an action-forward film has the courage to do that. Now, if I had to give you my final verdict in the language of feeling rather than ratings, I'd say One Move God Mode is the kind of cinematic adrenaline shot that also knows where your bruises are. It's a revenge fantasy structure wrapped around an identity story, and it uses myth not as decoration but as amplification, making a very human ache feel ocean-sized. It's not perfect, some supporting arcs are thinner than the main spine, and the escalation can move so fast you wish it would breathe for one more scene before the next thunderclap. But when it hits with the force of a tide finally coming in, and by the time Ethan stops being the punchline and starts being the storm, you're not just entertained, you're emotionally implicated, because the movie quietly asks you which side of the arena you'd be standing on, whether you'd be laughing, whether you'd be silent, or whether you'd be the one person brave enough to look at the trash kid with the rusty pitchfork and see a legend before the world gives you permission. And that's the thing I keep thinking about after the credits. The weapon was never the miracle. The miracle was the moment Ethan stopped believing the lie. Everything else, the trident, the God mode, the path to Olympus, is just what the truth looks like when it finally takes shape in the world. There are movies with titles that try to hide what they are, and then there is One Move God Mode, a title so loud, so shameless, so gloriously overpowered that you almost expect it to come with a cheat code, a lightning bolt, and a warning label for damaged egos, and somehow the wildest part is that the movie actually earns that name, because this is not one of those fantasy stories where the hero needs 3 films, 7 prophecies, and 100 speeches to become interesting. This is a story about a man the world has buried under dirt, insult, and low expectations, and the second he realizes who he really is, the whole structure of power starts cracking like dry earth before a tidal wave. Before we continue, please subscribe to my channel Bongo Gaming, and let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Now let's talk about why this 2026 release came out swinging like an underdog revenge myth dipped in sea god thunder, and why for all of its obvious crowd-pleasing energy, it actually has more emotional bite than the title might make you think. One Move God Mode arrives at a time when fantasy cinema has a weird problem, because so much of the genre lately either takes itself so seriously that it forgets how to entertain, or it moves so fast trying to chase irony and quips that it forgets how to feel. And this movie walks right into that dead zone with muddy boots, a broken reputation, and a rusty pitchfork and says, no, we're doing myth the old way. We're doing pain, humiliation, destiny, class resentment, divine inheritance, and the exact kind of wish fulfillment that audiences have always loved when it is done with confidence. And confidence is really the key word here, because One Move God Mode knows exactly what fantasy it is selling. It is not pretending to be subtle art house mythology, and it is not pretending to deconstruct the power fantasy at every turn. It understands the primal thrill of watching someone the world has spat on stand up in the middle of a rigged system and reveal that the thing everyone mocked is actually the thing that will break the entire hierarchy apart. That is ancient storytelling on a very human level, and the film taps into it hard. The premise is instantly attractive in the way all great mythic underdog setups are attractive. Ethan, who has spent his life as a farmer and apparently a nobody, has been made to believe that he is weak, useless, unlucky even to be tolerated. He doesn't live like the son of a god. He lives like the kind of man people talk over, order around, and dismiss before he finishes a sentence. You can feel the weight of that in the opening stretch of the film, and one thing I really appreciated is that the movie does not rush past his humiliation just to get to the cool powers. It actually lingers there long enough to make the awakening matter. It understands that power means nothing on screen if powerlessness never felt real. So when we first meet Ethan, he is not simply poor, and he is not simply humble. He is conditioned. There is a difference. He has absorbed the world's verdict on him so deeply that he moves through his own life like an apology. That is a much sadder and more compelling starting point than the standard secret chosen one setup, because this is not just a hero who doesn't know he is special. This is a hero who has been trained not to imagine he could ever be anything at all. That emotional poisoning is what the movie uses as its true first antagonist. The setting helps a lot. This world feels old, stratified, and cruel in ways fantasy often talks about but does not always dramatize. The divide between nobles and laborers is not just decorative costume design here. It is baked into every interaction. Ethan works the land. The nobles own the narrative. They define worth. They decide who gets to be called noble, who gets to be called gifted, who gets laughed out of the square, and who gets fed to the machine. That social cruelty is why the night trial becomes such a perfect story engine. The night trial is not just a tournament. It is a public ritual of hierarchy. It is the place where the elite are seen, where the powerful display power to the powerless, and where someone like Ethan is expected to know his place just by entering the arena and letting the room laugh him back into the soil. And the weapon, that rusty pitchfork, is one of the smartest visual ideas in the whole film, because from the start it works on 3 levels at once. First, it marks him as a farmer in a world that worships decorated steel. Second, it symbolizes how he has been reduced to labor, to survival, to something utilitarian and unglamorous. And third, once the story opens its hand, it becomes this perfect mythic reveal, because the pitchfork is not a joke, not really, not at all, it is a trident in disguise, a divine inheritance hidden inside the image of peasant drudgery. That is a great piece of fantasy symbolism. The tool of cultivation is also the weapon of reckoning. The thing that feeds the land can also drown kingdoms. And the film gets so much mileage out of that idea that even when it leans into pure spectacle, it still feels thematically rooted. As a 2026 fantasy release, One Move God Mode also feels surprisingly aware of what modern audiences want from these larger-than-life stories. People still love myth, but they want immediacy, they want emotional access, and they want that intoxicating sense that something monumental can happen at any second. This movie has that. It may borrow the broad pleasure structure of overpowered hero stories, the sort of narrative-shaped gamers, anime fans, fantasy readers, and action lovers instantly recognize, but it doesn't feel lazy. It feels sharpened. It knows the satisfaction of a level 1 character walking into a room full of maxed-out elites and casually revealing that the entire game balance was a lie. It knows the pleasure of delayed recognition. It knows the crowd wants to see arrogance shattered. But crucially, it also knows that if the only thing you give the audience is domination, the story burns out. So underneath the crowd-pleasing rise from trash to legend, there is a current of grief running through Ethan's story, grief over time lost, identity stolen, and a father-sized absence at the center of his life. The fact that his father is Poseidon is not just cool lore. It is emotional architecture. Gods in myth are often absent, cruel, symbolic, or impossible to live up to, and Ethan's journey carries all of that weight. He is the son of vastness itself, of the sea, of force, of a power that does not ask permission, and yet he has been living in a body and social role designed to teach him smallness. That contradiction is the heartbeat of the movie. Without spoiling every turn, because honestly part of the fun here is the release of the reveals and the escalation of how much power the story is willing to put on screen, the broad movement of the plot is simple in the best possible way. Ethan enters the night trial with what everyone believes is a pathetic weapon and even more pathetic chances. The nobles mock him, the room treats him like entertainment, and the film carefully calibrates that humiliation so you can practically feel the audience grinding their teeth waiting for the reversal. But the reversal is not immediate in a cheap jump scare way. The movie stretches it. It lets the sneers settle in. It lets Ethan's own doubt hang in the air. It lets us wonder whether he even understands what he carries. Then when the hidden truth inside that rusted pitchfork starts to emerge, One Move God Mode delivers the kind of scene that people watch movies like this for. And what I love is that the scene is not just staged as a power-up. It is staged as recognition. The weapon does not merely transform. It answers him. The sea does not merely obey. It remembers. There is an awakening quality to the sequence that goes beyond effects. Ethan is not putting on power from the outside like armor. He is stepping into a truth that was denied to him. That difference matters, because it turns the spectacle into catharsis. Once the film hits that first major eruption, it never quite drops the audience again. It understands the value of momentum, but it also makes a smart choice by not turning Ethan into an instantly smooth, smug godling who suddenly knows everything. He becomes terrifyingly capable, yes, but he still has to emotionally catch up to what has happened. That gives the middle of the film more texture than you might expect. He is no longer the powerless farmer, but he is also not yet comfortable being the son of Poseidon, not yet fully aligned with the force moving through him, and definitely not emotionally free from the years of insult that shaped him. So you get this compelling tension where every display of strength is also haunted by memory. Every enemy he crushes feels like an answer to every moment he was told to lower his eyes. That can be unbelievably satisfying on a surface level, and the film absolutely indulges that, but it also asks a deeper question. When a person who has been taught self-erasure finally discovers they were never small, what happens to all that buried pain? One move God Mode answers by letting Ethan's power carry anger, not just skill. And that anger is where the movie gets its edge. The story overview, if I keep it spoiler-conscious, is essentially the movement from concealment to revelation, from social death to mythic rebirth. The first phase is all about degradation and false identity. The second phase is the trial and the tearing away of the lie. The third phase, and this is where the film becomes more ambitious than just a tournament fantasy, is Ethan reckoning with the implications of his bloodline and the wider cosmic order attached to it. The world beyond the village and the court starts to open up. Olympus shifts from abstract legend to looming destination. Enemies stop being merely local bullies and begin to represent institutions, bloodlines, systems, and old powers that do not want a hidden heir rising from the dirt. I won't ruin the specifics of the later confrontations, the best visual callbacks, or the exact way the movie stages the transition from earthly humiliation to divine mission, but I will say this. The film is smart enough to understand that the road from nobody to legend is most satisfying when the hero doesn't just defeat opponents, he rewrites the meaning of the world they live in. That is why the action lands. Ethan is not simply stronger than the nobles. He makes their entire definition of worth look absurd. As a central character, Ethan works because the movie never loses sight of the contradiction inside him. He is physically grounded but spiritually oceanic. He has the body language of a man who has spent his life working the soil, but there is something in the way the camera starts framing him after the awakening that suggests hidden scale, as if the film itself suddenly sees more space around him. The lead performance carries a lot of this. Even without making Ethan overly talkative, the actor sells in a fracture. Early on, he doesn't play weakness as stupidity, and that is crucial. Too many underdog stories make the hero look dim just so the transformation appears bigger later. Here, Ethan is not foolish. He is silenced. He is hesitant because he has been made hesitant. He questions himself because he has been trained to question himself. That makes him sympathetic without turning him into a saint, and when the power starts surfacing, the performance doesn't flip into empty swagger either. There is awe, confusion, disbelief, rage, and then slowly, almost painfully, a sense of permission. Ethan's greatest arc is not just learning he is powerful. It is learning he is allowed to exist at full scale. That is a much richer transformation than a simple power boost. The nobles, on the other hand, written in a way that might not be subtle, but subtle is not what this movie needs from them. They are embodiments of entitlement. They live in polished armor and inherited certainty. They sneer because sneering is the language of people who have never once doubted that the world was arranged for their comfort. The film uses them as a chorus of contempt, and honestly, that works because the story depends on making the hierarchy visible. You need to feel the texture of disdain before it gets smashed. Some viewers will probably say the aristocratic antagonists are too broad, too openly cruel, too theatrical in their humiliation of Ethan, but I think the movie is operating in a mythic register where clarity matters more than nuance in certain roles. These are not intimate, realist villains. They are guardians of a rotten order. Their job is to tell Ethan who he is not, and then be annihilated by the truth. That said, the film does hint that their cruelty comes partly from fragility. They are so vicious because they sense, before they understand, that the social contract protecting them is not natural law at all. The minute someone from below stands in the arena and refuses to remain ridiculous, their whole identity starts shaking. That's great drama, and the movie mines it for both spectacle and subtext. The divine layer of the story is where things get especially interesting. Poseidon, though more a looming presence than a constant character, hangs over the film like weather. You feel him in the sound design, in the movement of water, in the visual language whenever Ethan's power responds instead of merely explodes. The absence of the father becomes part of the atmosphere. Ethan's inheritance is both gift and wound. He is powerful because of it, but he has also been abandoned to grow in ignorance, mockery, and hardship. That means every time the movie leans into the coolness of sea god imagery, there is also a little bitterness in the frame. Where were you when he was being broken down? Where were you when he was taught to call himself nothing? The film doesn't reduce that tension to a neat answer, and I appreciate that. It lets divine lineage remain emotionally complicated. That choice gives the Olympus setup more gravity. Ethan is not marching toward some shining palace just because destiny says so. He is moving toward the source of both his power and his abandonment. That is story fuel. It gives the sequel-baiting, world-expanding elements an emotional reason to exist. And this is where the movie avoids one of the biggest traps in franchise-minded fantasy. It does not make the future the point of the present. The promise of Olympus is exciting, yes, but the film keeps Ethan's personal awakening front and center. We are invested not because another realm exists, but because this specific man now has to confront the scale of what was hidden from him. Visually, One Move God Mode has a pretty clear strategy, and it's a good one. The early village and field sequences lean into dryness, weight, repetition, and earthy fatigue. You can almost feel dust on the lens. Life is physical, limited, measured in labor and endurance. Ethan belongs to the soil because he has been trapped there, and the movie wants you to understand how heavy that world is before it starts inviting the sea into it. Then when the power starts to reveal itself, the whole sensory palette shifts. Blues arrive like prophecy. Air seems charged. Metal and water stop being separate things and begin talking to each other. There are shots where the rusty pitchfork catches light just differently enough that you sense the weapon's true nature before the characters do, and that kind of visual foreshadowing is simple but effective. The trident reveal, or rather the gradual trident recognition, is handled with the kind of mythic seriousness the movie needs. It does not wink at the audience. It does not treat the reveal like an ironic joke. It lets the moment be huge. I love that. There is a sincerity here that feels increasingly rare in big spectacle fantasy. The camera isn't embarrassed by awe. It believes in it. And when a movie believes in its own awe, the audience usually has a much easier time believing too. The action scenes themselves are less about endless choreography for its own sake and more about force, timing, and release. That may sound like a limitation, but in this specific film it becomes part of the identity. The title tells you what kind of power fantasy you are getting. One Move God Mode. The movie takes that idea seriously. Ethan's combat style, especially once the divine inheritance unlocks, is not based on flashy combo chains or acrobatic flourishes designed to impress with complexity. It is about overwhelming certainty. It is about a world arranged around one impossible answer. That makes each major strike feel consequential. The tension is not, can he land 40 hits? The tension is, what happens to the room when he finally decides enough is enough? That is a very smart distinction. It allows the film to stage action like judgment. Every release of power becomes narrative punctuation. And because the movie spends time building humiliation and disbelief first, those moments land like emotional detonations, not just visual ones. I can already tell this is the type of film where certain scenes are going to get replayed endlessly, clipped, memed, posted, and revisited not because they are merely loud, but because they satisfy something deep and almost ancient in the viewer. It is the fantasy of revelation. It is the fantasy that the world has misread you, and one day, in front of everyone who dismissed you, reality itself will correct the record. That is why the night trial scene, and everything surrounding it, works so well. It is not just a cool arena sequence. It is a public correction of identity. The movie understands humiliation as a story investment. Every sneer is a deposit. Every laugh is a promise. And when the payoff comes, the return is enormous. Emotionally, what surprised me most is how often the film makes room for silence. You would think with a title like One Move God Mode that the whole thing would be noise, acceleration, and bravado, and yes, there is plenty of that, but some of the best moments are quieter. Ethan holding the weapon like he doesn't quite know whether it belongs to him or he belongs to it. The look on his face when power answers him before language can. The pause after a room full of mockery goes dead. Those moments matter because they turn spectacle into feeling. A lot of big fantasy movies can show you force. Far fewer can show you what force does to a person's idea of himself. Here, the emotional aftershock is part of the pleasure. The film is not really about becoming someone else. It is about recovering someone stolen. That recovery gives the story its soul. And if I had to sum up why the character work succeeds despite the larger-than-life setup, it is because the movie knows that inferiority is not Ethan's personality. It is his wound. Once you understand that, every beat of the narrative gains clarity. Why does the laughter hurt so much? Because it confirms the lie he has lived under. Why does the awakening feel so massive? Because it doesn't just grant capability, it invalidates the lie. Why does the journey to Olympus matter? Because he is not simply chasing greater power, he is walking toward the origin of a life that was concealed from him. That's character-driven myth, and it gives the film more staying power than a simple revenge fantasy. Now, in terms of cinematic analysis, One Move God Mode succeeds most when it trusts scale and simplicity at the same time. Too many modern fantasy blockbusters are afraid of clean iconography. They over-design everything, over-explain every rule, clutter every set, and by the time the big moment arrives there is no visual hierarchy left. Here, the film often reduces the frame to a few elemental oppositions: earth and sea, rust and silver, labor and nobility, silence and laughter, shame and revelation. That simplicity makes the mythic beats hit harder. The weapon doesn't need 1,000 moving parts if the audience already understands what it means. Ethan doesn't need a speech about oppression every 5 minutes if his posture in the first act and his stance in the trial tell the story better. This movie gets that. There is a confidence in the visual storytelling that helps carry even the more familiar plot beats. The score also deserves real praise. Rather than trying to be wall-to-wall epic in a generic fantasy way, it often builds from low, almost mournful textures into something tidal and immense. You can hear the sea in the music before you fully see it in the action. There are moments when the score seems to hesitate with Ethan, as if the soundtrack itself is waiting for him to remember. That's a subtle touch, but it deepens the entire atmosphere. Then when the God Mode moments finally hit, the music does not merely become louder. It becomes inevitable. It rolls in. It floods the frame. It sounds less like triumph being granted and more like truth returning. That's exactly the emotional note the movie needs. Sound design, too, is crucial here. Water in this film is not background ambience. It is memory, warning, identity, and force. The way the trident-like pitchfork begins interacting with the environment, the metallic resonance layered with deeper oceanic pressure, the feeling that air itself is becoming liquid around Ethan when he taps into his heritage, all of that gives the power and identity beyond visual effects. You don't just see the awakening. You hear a world-changing frequency. And because this is a story about a man rising from the lowliest social position into a realm of divine recognition, that sensory transformation matters. It tells the audience that the universe itself has a different opinion of Ethan than society does. One of my favorite thematic threads in the movie is the relationship between labor and nobility. The film is not subtle about it, and honestly it shouldn't be. Ethan has been shaped by work, by the land, by necessity. The nobles have been shaped by image, inheritance, and performance. So when the film reveals that the humble pitchfork is secretly the godly trident, it does something powerful symbolically. It collapses the false distinction between what is low and what is exalted. The farming tool and the divine weapon are not opposites. They are the same object under different conditions of recognition. That is the entire movie in one symbol. Ethan was never worthless. He was misnamed. His life was not low in essence, only low in status. That is why audiences respond so viscerally to stories like this. Beneath the fantasy, there is a very human hunger to believe that our unnoticed, worn down, ordinary selves may contain something the world's categories cannot measure. One Move God Mode takes that feeling and mythologizes it without mocking it. That's one reason it works. Another big theme is the violence of imposed identity. Ethan has not just been ignored. He has been told who he is by people invested in his smallness. That's more sinister. The film suggests that systems survive by making the strong doubt themselves and the privileged appear natural. The trial is therefore not only a contest of bodies but of narratives. Who has the right to stand here? Who gets called worthy? Who gets to be seen as ridiculous before they even act? When Ethan enters the arena with that rusty tool, everyone thinks they are seeing the obvious truth. The film is brilliant in how it weaponizes that assumption. It says, look at how easily power mistakes appearance for essence. Look at how authority laughs right before it loses control. And because the movie dramatizes this in such an accessible, emotionally direct way, it hits beyond fantasy fandom. Anyone who has ever felt underestimated, boxed in, or talked down to can plug right into the emotional current. The father-son dimension, even in its mythic form, adds another layer. Stories about divine parentage often risk becoming shallow shortcuts to power, but here the absence of Poseidon creates emotional complexity rather than just prestige. Ethan's lineage is not comforting. It is destabilizing. It explains his power, yes, but it also explains the scale of what was kept from him. He has to wrestle not only with what he is, but with why he was left to suffer unknowing. That unanswered ache keeps the film from becoming emotionally too clean. Even as Ethan rises, there is pain in the ascent. There is loss in the revelation. You cannot learn you were born for vastness without mourning the years spent believing you were nothing. That mourning is baked into the best scenes, and it is part of why the movie has more resonance than a simple, surprise, he was special all along narrative. In terms of pacing, the film mostly gets the balance right. The first act takes its time, but it has to. If the movie rushed Ethan's degradation, the later catharsis would feel hollow. By letting us live in his diminished world, even just enough to feel the rhythm of his smallness, the film earns the violence of the reversal. The middle stretch, where Ethan is caught between awakening and full purpose, is perhaps the trickiest section, and while I think it remains engaging, this is where some viewers might feel the story occasionally wobbles between introspective myth and full-throttle action fantasy. There are moments when the lore starts pressing in, and you can sense the screenplay trying to widen the world quickly enough to justify the Olympus trajectory. A little of that exposition is clunkier than the rest. Not disastrously so, but you do feel the machinery. The film is so good at emotional clarity and symbolic storytelling that whenever it has to stop and explain systems, bloodlines, or divine politics in plain terms, it loses a bit of that electricity. Still, it recovers fast because it keeps returning to Ethan's internal state and the raw momentum of his rise. And honestly, the movie's awareness of its own appeal helps. It knows exactly when the audience wants a line, a stare, a challenge, a shattered expectation, or a display of force. It is paced by emotional appetite more than by strict plot logic, and that makes it very watchable. If I had a real criticism, beyond a few exposition-heavy stretches, it would be that some of the supporting characters exist more as functions than as fully textured individuals. Again, in mythic storytelling that is not always a fatal flaw. Archetypes can be powerful. But there are places where you can feel that the film is so focused on Ethan's central arc that it lets everyone around him operate at one volume. The cruel nobles are often effectively hateful, but some blend together as embodiments of arrogance rather than memorable personalities. A figure or two on Ethan's side, especially those who sense there is something more in him before the reveal, could have used a little more shading. There are hints of emotional support, fear, doubt, and loyalty around him, but the screenplay usually rushes past them to get back to the propulsion of his awakening. Depending on your taste, that will either feel like efficient myth-making or a missed opportunity for deeper relational drama. For me, it lands somewhere in between. I wanted a bit more from the world around Ethan, but I also understand why the film chooses to keep the lens tight. This is his reclamation story above all else. Performance-wise, the movie is carried by the lead in a way that can't be overstated. If Ethan were played with too much self-conscious coolness, the whole thing would collapse into empty dominance fantasy. If he were played too meekly, the awakening would feel synthetic. The actor threads that needle well. Early Ethan is not charismatic in the obvious sense, but he is watchable because he feels internal, bruised, alert to humiliation before it arrives. Post-awakening Ethan does not suddenly turn into a smirking machine. The change comes more in presence than in personality. He begins occupying space differently. He looks at people differently. He seems to feel gravity less and consequence more. That is good screen acting. It turns a supernatural rise into something psychologically legible. You believe that this is still the same man, only now the buried architecture of his identity is showing through. The antagonistic performances are satisfyingly severe. The nobles sneer, posture, and overcommit in ways that some might call operatic, but again, the movie wants that. It wants the room to embody contempt loudly enough that the payoff lands with full force. The trick is that they do not feel like they wandered in from a different film. Their heightened arrogance matches the mythic register. You are meant to hate them. You are meant to want the floor pulled out from under them. They do the job. The more mysterious, divine-adjacent energies in the film are handled with the right amount of restraint. There is wisdom in not overexposing the godly elements too early. The film lets Poseidon remain more pressure than person, more inheritance than exposition dump, and that choice keeps the supernatural side feeling large. Sometimes the unseen is more powerful, especially in a story about discovery. You don't want the mystery fully domesticating itself in the first hour. And to the movie's credit, it mostly avoids that. It lets the audience feel that Ethan's awakening opens onto a world much bigger than the current conflict, which is exactly what you want if the Olympus thread is meant to feel exciting rather than obligatory. Now, let's talk about why this thing is likely to hit so hard with audiences beyond just fantasy fans. At its core, One Move God Mode is built on an emotion that is almost universally accessible, the pain of being underestimated and the dream of definitive recognition. Not delayed praise, not reluctant acknowledgement, but undeniable recognition that arrives in public and rearranges the social order around you. That is one of the oldest and strongest fantasies in storytelling. This film packages it in Greek myth, armor, mud, and tidal power, but the feeling underneath is familiar to anyone who has ever been treated as less than what they are. It is revenge without pure ugliness, because the revenge is not only against people. It is against the lie itself. Ethan is not just settling scores. He is exposing a false world. That distinction is why the movie feels cathartic rather than merely cruel. It invites the audience to participate in the joy of correction. And you can imagine exactly the kind of reaction this movie is going to generate. The arena sequence is the obvious centerpiece for crowd response. It is the kind of scene built for gasps, for theater noise, for the collective, "Oh no, they messed with the wrong guy," energy that turns a screening into an event. But I think the film's longer-term impact comes from the symbol of the pitchfork itself. That image is too good not to stick. A battered farmer's tool that is secretly a god's trident, mocked by the elite until it reveals its true nature, is one of those ideas that lingers because it is both cool and meaningful. It works as an action reveal, a class symbol, a mythic inheritance marker, and a meme all at once. People are going to latch onto that. They are going to use it as shorthand for hidden greatness, underestimated power, late recognition, and the simple pleasure of arrogant people getting humbled. The title helps too. One Move God Mode is absurdly direct, and in a landscape where so many titles blur together, there is real value in being memorable. It sounds like something between an arena exploit, a legendary build, and a prophecy scrawled by someone who is done losing. That makes it easy to joke about, but it also makes it easy to remember. And because the film mostly delivers on the fantasy the title promises, the title stops feeling silly and starts feeling iconic. That is not easy to do. It reminds me of how some stories succeed by refusing embarrassment. If a movie knows what it is, commits to it, and brings emotional honesty into even its most outrageous setup, the audience will follow. One Move God Mode understands that rule. Culturally, I can see this movie resonating especially strongly in online spaces where underdog empowerment narratives already thrive. Gamers, fantasy readers, anime and manhwa fans, myth lovers, and anyone with a soft spot for hidden overpowered protagonists are going to have a field day with this. It speaks the language of progression fantasy without fully becoming one. It borrows the thrill of a stat reveal, the satisfaction of a hidden class unlock, the spectacle of a raid boss suddenly realizing the peasant has endgame gear, but it translates those pleasures into cinematic myth. That crossover appeal is smart. It means the movie can be enjoyed on the primal level of, "that was awesome," while also scratching deeper genre itches. And because the emotional spine is clear, it is not inaccessible to viewers who don't live in those fandom spaces. You do not need to know any gaming or anime vocabulary to understand the satisfaction of the night trial scene. You just need a pulse and maybe a little history with being overlooked. In terms of weaknesses that could affect cultural staying power, I do think the film's side character thinness and occasional lore compression might keep some critics from fully embracing it as a top-tier fantasy drama. There will be people who say it is too archetypal, too engineered around payoff moments, too blunt in its class dynamics, or too openly committed to empowerment spectacle. And to be honest, some of those critiques are not entirely wrong. This is not a film whose deepest ambition is ambiguity. It wants to move you in clear lines. It wants to thrill, vindicate, and stay you. But there is a difference between simplicity and shallowness, and I think One Move God Mode lands on the right side of that line more often than not. Its emotional clarity is not laziness. It is design. It knows exactly what mythic nerve it wants to hit. The other thing I appreciate is that the film doesn't make Ethan's rise feel costless, even while embracing the fantasy. The power is spectacular, yes, but it is tied to identity upheaval, to a destabilizing inheritance, and to the realization that his life has been built on a deception. That gives the empowerment an ache. He is not just winning. He is waking up inside a wound. That's a strong emotional engine, and it's why the story stays with you after the loud scenes. You remember the action, but you also remember the quiet cruelty of the early world and the strange sadness of discovering you were made for more than the life you were allowed to imagine. There is something tragic in that, and the movie knows it. That awareness elevates it. The best way I can describe the experience of watching One Move God Mode is that it feels like a revenge fantasy, a mythic origin story, and a class revolt legend all sharing the same bloodstream. It is dusty and tidal. It is humiliating and exalting. It gives you the satisfaction of seeing a broken hierarchy get publicly shattered, but it also gives you a hero whose journey is not only about strength. It is about permission. Permission to stand upright. Permission to be seen. Permission to stop apologizing for existing. That is powerful material when handled sincerely, and sincerity is really the word I keep coming back to with this film. For all its giant premise and meme-ready title, it is surprisingly earnest. It believes in the pain of Ethan's smallness. It believes in the ecstasy of his revelation. It believes in the mythic force of seaborn destiny rising out of farm dirt. And because it believes, the movie can ask you to believe too. I also think the film deserves credit for how it handles escalation. A lot of overpowered protagonist stories peak too early. They show their best card in the first big reveal and spend the rest of the runtime trying and failing to top it. One Move God Mode avoids that trap by understanding that escalation is not only about bigger explosions or larger enemies. It is also about widening context. The first eruption of power matters because it breaks a room. Later developments matter because they begin to imply what else is wrong with the world, who else is threatened by Ethan's existence, and what his awakening means beyond immediate revenge. The scale grows because the meaning grows. That is smart storytelling. It means the Olympus destination does not feel like a random sequel hook tacked on for franchise potential. It feels like the natural horizon line of Ethan's identity crisis. Once you reveal that a farmer is the son of Poseidon, the village can no longer contain the story. The world has to open. The heavens, or at least the divine political structure above, have to become relevant. And yet the film wisely ends not on closure but on expansion. Ethan's rise to legend is only beginning, but it has reached a point where he is no longer reacting to other people's definitions. He is moving under his own name now, even if he is still learning what that name means. That's a satisfying place to leave him, because it gives you emotional completion inside narrative continuation. From a reviewer's standpoint, that is often the hardest balance for this sort of movie to hit. Too much closure and future possibilities feel unnecessary. Too little closure and the film feels like a trailer for another film. One Move God Mode mostly threads that needle. By the time the credits are ready to roll, you feel like you watched a full metamorphosis, not just a pilot episode with a budget. And that matters a lot. If you're wondering whether this is one of those movies that only works if you switch your brain off, I would actually say no, not exactly. It is definitely built to be viscerally enjoyable. It wants you cheering. It wants you leaning forward. It wants that grin on your face when Ethan finally stops letting people tell him what he is. But it also works because the emotional logic is coherent. It understands shame, class humiliation, longing for recognition, and the dangerous thrill of waking into power. Those are real feelings, and the movie uses fantasy not to escape them but to magnify them. That is why even the broad beats land. It is not complexity alone that gives a movie weight. Sometimes it is conviction. Sometimes it is the precision with which a simple emotional pattern is drawn. This film has that precision more often than you might expect. Would I say it is perfect? No. I think a few of the middle act explanations flatten the mystery a little, and I do wish one or two supporting relationships had more depth. There are moments when you can see the screenplay sprinting to keep up with the size of its own mythology. A slightly richer web of side characters could have turned Ethan's transformation from deeply satisfying to truly unforgettable on an ensemble level. And if you are allergic to chosen one narratives, divine bloodlines, or stories that unapologetically center the fantasy of latent superiority being revealed, this may not convert you. It is operating proudly within that tradition. But if that tradition works on you even a little, One Move God Mode knows exactly how to make it sing. It gives you the mud before the thunder. It gives you the insult before the answer. It gives you a man bowed by the world and then dares to show what happens when the world is wrong. That is elemental storytelling. It taps into something older than genre trends. By the end of it, what stayed with me most was not just the spectacle, though yes, the spectacle is there, and yes, the power sequences are the kind of thing that will have people rewinding and sharing clips for weeks. What stayed with me was the image of Ethan holding a life he had been told was worthless and discovering that buried inside it was divinity. That is a beautiful fantasy, maybe one of the most enduring fantasies we have. The ordinary self as misrecognized greatness. The worn-out tool as hidden relic. The mocked outsider as the axis on which the world turns. One Move God Mode takes that fantasy and commits to it with enough emotional seriousness that it lands as more than just a hype machine. It becomes a story about reclamation, about truth surfacing through years of imposed smallness, about the sea inside a man who was forced to live like dust. And that final emotional register is why, for me, this movie works. It is not just about Ethan becoming powerful. It is about Ethan ceasing to participate in his own erasure. It is about the moment shame loses jurisdiction. It is about the sound a false order makes when it starts to break. So if you're asking for the verdict, here it is. One Move God Mode is bold, messy in places, deeply satisfying, emotionally sharper than expected, and powered by one of the most reliable engines in storytelling, the underdog who was never truly beneath anyone, only buried there until the right moment. It may not be the most intricate fantasy film of its era, but it is one of the most sincere in how it pursues catharsis, and in a time when so many big movies seem embarrassed to feel too much, there is something refreshing about one that steps into the arena, carries a rusty pitchfork like it already knows the truth, and then lets the heavens answer. If the mark of a memorable movie is that it leaves you with an image, a mood, and a sensation you can still feel after the plot details blur, then One Move God Mode absolutely has that. You remember the laugh of the nobles turning into silence. You remember the weight of the earth giving way to the force of the sea. You remember a man looking at the tool in his hand and realizing it was never just a tool. And above all, you remember the feeling, that sudden surge of impossible recognition, the fantasy that maybe what the world mocked, overlooked, or reduced in you was never weakness at all, just power waiting for its name. And once you get past that initial rush of seeing the arena flip from ridicule to reverence, the movie starts doing something even riskier, because it refuses to let Ethan's awakening be a clean, now I'm strong, now I'm happy, switch, and instead it treats godhood like a second kind of loneliness, like the moment you become powerful enough to end the game is also the moment you realize you were never really a player. You were a piece on someone else's board, and Ethan's face in the scenes. Immediately after his first eruption of power is the clearest proof of that, because he isn't smiling like a guy who just won, he's staring like someone who just woke up in a room he didn't know he was trapped inside, and I love that choice, because it tells you the film understands the emotional cost of transformation. It's not just that he can now crush the people who mocked him, it's that he can never go back to being invisible. And invisibility, twisted as it is, was the one kind of safety he had. This is where one move God mode's direction really earns points, because it starts using space differently. Earlier, Ethan is always framed as smaller than his environment, but after the awakening, the environment starts reacting to him, not just metaphorically but physically, with fabrics tugging like there's an unseen current, torch flames bending as if the air is breathing, dust lifting off stone in these little spirals that feel like the beginning of a storm, and it sells the idea that Ethan's presence is now an event, not a person. The one move concept also becomes more interesting the more you sit with it, because it isn't only a signature attack, it's a narrative statement. The movie is basically saying that power doesn't always come from training arcs and noble mentors, sometimes it comes from one moment of refusal, one moment where you stop performing weakness for the comfort of the people who benefit from it, and the film stages that refusal with a kind of ceremonial wait, like the entire kingdom has been waiting for someone to break the script and didn't even know it. And let's talk about the kingdom for a second, because the social world here is drawn in broad strokes but it's emotionally precise. You've got a culture that worships honor, but uses it to justify humiliation, that claims it's selecting knights for the realm but is really selecting bodies to maintain the realm's story about itself, and the trial overseers, guards, and noble sponsors all act like middle management in a system that's never been challenged. They're calm when they're in control. And they become frantic not when people get hurt, because pain is normal in their entertainment machine, but when control itself looks shaky. That's what Ethan threatens, not just individuals, but the legitimacy of the entire spectacle, and the movie captures that panic in little reaction shots that are honestly some of the sharpest commentary in the film, because you see how quickly the people in charge stop caring about rules and start caring about containment. Now, without going beat by beat into spoiler territory, the mid to late portion of the story uses Ethan's new status to raise a different kind of tension. Earlier the question was whether he'd survive humiliation, now the question is whether he'll be allowed to exist at all without being either owned or erased. And that's where the Poseidon lineage becomes a political problem, not just a personal revelation. The moment a demigod is visible, everyone wants to claim the narrative. Nobles want him framed as a freak accident or a threat, officials want him controlled and drafted into the state's mythology, and the common people, who have been trained to fear attention, start projecting their own hunger for justice onto him, turning Ethan into a symbol before he's even had time to understand himself. That's one of the movie's smartest undercurrents. It shows you that becoming a legend is not entirely something you choose, it's something other people do to you, and once they've done it, they feel entitled to the legend's behavior. They want the symbol to stay clean, predictable, inspiring, and Ethan is none of those things, because Ethan is a person who just found out his entire life was a lie. You can feel the film's emotional temperature change here, because it starts layering in grief under the hype, and the best scenes are the quieter ones where Ethan is alone with the trident, not swinging it, just holding it like it's heavy in a way metal shouldn't be heavy, like it weighs as much as every insult he swallowed. The sound design keeps doing that underwater trick too, where certain moments feel muffled, like Ethan is hearing the world through an ocean he can't turn off, and it's a brilliant way of making divinity feel invasive rather than purely empowering. Performance-wise, the actor's restraint is doing so much work here, because the easy choice would be to turn Ethan into an Avenger with swagger, but the film commits to a more haunted transformation. Ethan's eyes change first. Like he's looking through people instead of at them, like he's finally seeing the wiring behind their words, and then his voice changes, not louder, but steadier, which makes every line land like a verdict instead of a comeback. The antagonistic nobles, meanwhile, are intentionally theatrical in the early scenes, big laughs, big gestures, performative disgust, because that's how people act when they are sure the world is on their side. But once Ethan's power is undeniable, that theater collapses into something uglier and more real, bargaining, threats, pleas, sudden attempts at mercy, and that shift is honestly satisfying because it's psychologically accurate. Bullies love a stage until the stage belongs to someone else. Cinematically, the film has a knack for turning simple imagery into mythic symbolism. The rust on the pitchfork reads like neglect, like a divine inheritance left to rot because the world decided the boy holding it wasn't worth the truth. the arena reads like society's mouth, laughing and then choking when the joke becomes a storm, and water, obviously, becomes the language of ancestry, but it also becomes the language of emotion, because the bigger the wave, the deeper the feeling Ethan has been suppressing. Even the way the camera treats crowds evolves. Early crowds are faceless, a wall of noise, but later, once Ethan becomes dangerous, the film starts isolating individual faces in that wall, reminding you that a crowd isn't a single monster, it's 1,000 choices, 1,000 people deciding whether to laugh, to stay silent, or to step back when things get real. That matters because the movie's theme isn't only, the nobles are evil, it's also, how many people allow evil to be normal because it's easier than risking attention, and Ethan's rise forces everyone to reveal themselves. Pacing-wise, the movie's second half accelerates like a current picking up speed, and while I do think there are moments where it could have paused to deepen a couple relationships, especially any potential friendships or alliances formed around the trial, the trade-off is that the film maintains this breathless inevitability, like once Ethan awakens, the world can't put the lid back on, and it makes the final stretch feel less like a typical third-act showdown and more like the start of a larger myth. And that's where the Olympus setup becomes so important, because Olympus is not treated like a shiny reward at the top of the mountain, it's treated like the nerve center of the story's entire power structure, like the place where the logic of, some people are born to rule, was first written into stone, and by having Ethan set off toward it, the film is basically promising that the real conflict isn't over who wins a trial, it's over who gets to define worth, mortals with titles, or a demigod who grew up in dirt and refuses to bow. That final pivot is also where the movie's title clicks again in a broader sense. God Mode isn't just Ethan turning on a cheat code, it's Ethan becoming the cheat code that breaks a rigged world, and the question the film leaves you with is whether breaking the world is the same thing as fixing it. I've seen a lot of viewers come out of this film talking about the hype moments, and yes, there are plenty, but I think the reason it's going to linger culturally is that it taps into a modern, very real feeling, that the systems we live under often feel like arenas designed to humiliate you into compliance, and that the fantasy of one move isn't about violence, it's about finally being impossible to dismiss. That's why clips of Ethan's turning point are going to travel, why reaction videos are going to explode, why people are going to argue about whether the film glorifies revenge or simply refuses to sanitize righteous anger, because it lives right on that line, and it knows it. If you're asking me whether One Move God Mode is worth your time, the answer depends on what you want. If you want a clean, comforting hero's journey where power solves trauma neatly, this movie is too stormy for that. But if you want a cinematic underdog myth that understands humiliation as an injury and power as a consequence, and you want action that feels like emotion made physical, then the ride is absolutely worth it, because by the time Ethan walks away from that arena and the story points him toward Olympus, you don't just feel like you watched someone level up, you feel like you watched the world realize it has been laughing at the wrong person, and now it's the world that doesn't know what to do with its own fear. And maybe that is the deepest reason this movie is going to stick with people long after the initial hype, because underneath all the thunder, all the arena humiliation, all the divine power and shattered pride, One Move God Mode understands something incredibly simple and incredibly human. There is a special kind of pain in living beneath a lie about yourself, especially when that lie has been repeated so often by the world around you that it starts to sound like your own voice, and there is an equally powerful kind of release in finally breaking that spell, in finally standing in the space that was always yours, and letting everyone who benefited from your silence see what they refused to recognize. That is why Ethan's journey hits with such force. It is not only fantasy spectacle. It is emotional unmasking. It is the story of a man who was reduced until he almost disappeared, and then discovered that what looked like the lowest point of existence was actually the burial place of something mythic. And the film keeps returning to that image in different forms, whether it is the rust hiding the trident, the mud hiding the air, the mockery hiding fear, or the ordinary life hiding divine blood. Everything in this story is about misrecognition, and every great moment in the movie comes from truth punching through disguise. That is elegant in a very primal way. It gives the whole film a kind of inevitability. Even when the plot is straightforward, even when you can sense where a scene is heading, it still feels satisfying because the movie is not interested in tricking you. It is interested in charging the emotional air until the reveal lands like destiny. And honestly, there is something refreshing about a film that knows anticipation can be just as pleasurable as surprise. You know the nobles are going to regret laughing. You know that weapon is not really what it seems. You know Ethan is moving toward something enormous. The movie is not built around hiding these truths from you. It is built around making you ache for the moment everyone else has to face them too. That's a very different storytelling rhythm, and when it works beautifully. It also helps that the movie never completely loses the roughness of Ethan's beginnings. Even after the awakening, he doesn't become untouchably polished. There is still dirt in the soul of the film. There is still a sense that this power rose out of labor, out of exhaustion, out of a life lived under pressure rather than above it. And that texture matters because it keeps the fantasy from floating away into abstraction. Ethan does not feel like some distant, ornamental demigod dropped onto the screen for admiration. He feels like somebody who had to survive first. Somebody who had to endure the crushing boredom and sadness of being nobody before becoming somebody the world can no longer ignore. That transition from endurance to force is where the movie really finds its emotional identity. It is not just the thrill of dominance. It is the thrill of delayed becoming. And because of that, even the larger mythic setup toward Olympus carries a current of emotional realism. We understand why Ethan would go. Not just because plot says he must, but because once you discover your life has been built on concealment, standing still is no longer possible. He has to move toward the source. He has to ask the questions the earthbound version of his life could never answer. He has to confront whatever gods, histories, and betrayals shaped his existence before he was old enough to know his own name. That makes the ending feel less like an advertisement for a sequel and more like the natural next breath in a life that has finally started. And if there is a reason audiences are likely to become deeply attached to this film, it is because it balances completion and yearning in just the right way. We get enough victory to feel fed. We get enough expansion to stay hungry. That is a hard balance to strike, and one move God mode gets close enough that I walked away not just satisfied, but curious, and curiosity is one of the most valuable feelings a fantasy movie can leave you with. Another thing worth mentioning is how shamelessly the film understands the joy of presence. Some actors can make power look expensive, some can make it look flashy, but only a few can make it look earned by suffering, and that is the quality Ethan's performance eventually grows into. By the latter stretch of the film, he has a stillness that feels heavier than movement. He does not need to constantly prove what he can do because the movie has already taught us that the real power is in his refusal to remain small. That is why a glance matters. That is why a pause matters. That is why some of the best moments are not even attacks, but recognitions, the split second when somebody who mocked him realizes, too late, that they were standing in front of a force they could never have understood. Those reactions are part of the payoff too. This movie knows humiliation is a public emotion, and so is reversal. It lets the audience feast on the faces of certainty collapsing. It lets status crumble in real time. And because the hierarchy has been drawn so clearly, those moments hit like more than individual revenge. They feel almost mythically corrective, like the universe itself is adjusting the balance. That is a huge part of why this story feels so watchable. It isn't just delivering action. It is delivering moral geometry. It is arranging the world in a way that makes the fall of arrogance feel not only satisfying, but right. And that rightness, that sense that some buried imbalance is being repaired, is exactly the kind of emotional current that turns a fun fantasy into a repeat-watch comfort myth for a lot of people. I can easily imagine this becoming one of those movies viewers throw on whenever they want to feel that surge again, that reminder that false narratives can break, that mockery can fail, that hidden things can emerge in devastating form. And in a strange way, that may be where the title becomes almost perfect. One move God mode sounds exaggerated, almost like a joke you say before a ridiculous clutch moment, but once you've lived inside Ethan's story, it starts to feel less like a meme and more like a statement of emotional fact. Sometimes it really does take one move. One moment of recognition. One refusal to bow. One answer to years of dismissal. One truth surfacing so powerfully that it redraws the meaning of everything that came before. The title captures that flashpoint energy. The movie understands that the turning point in a life can be terrifyingly quick, even when the pain leading up to it was long. That contrast between years of suppression and one explosive unveiling is exactly what makes the fantasy sing. So yes, if you're looking for subtle chamber drama, this is not that movie. If you want a deeply ironic deconstruction of myth where every heroic beat is undercut by self-awareness, this isn't really playing that game either. But if you want a fantasy film that commits with a full heart to awe, vindication, buried power, and the intoxicating release of a broken order being challenged by someone it never saw coming, then this absolutely delivers. And more importantly, it delivers without forgetting the wound at the center of its hero. That is what gives it its best moments. Ethan is not satisfying because he is special. He is satisfying because he spent so long believing he wasn't. That gap between truth and self-perception is where all the electricity lives. The movie reaches into that gap and turns it into spectacle. That is why, by the final stretch, what should feel merely cool starts feeling emotional. Every strike has history in it. Every step forward has years behind it. Every glimpse toward Olympus has longing folded into it. And that is the kind of mythic emotion that can carry a movie farther than plot mechanics ever will. So my final verdict is this: One Move God Mode is the kind of film that understands exactly why people come to stories about hidden heirs, humiliated underdogs, and divine awakenings in the first place. We come for the fantasy, yes, but we stay for the recognition. We stay for the hope that what was dismissed in the beginning might become undeniable in the end. We stay for that sacred little dream that the world could be wrong about us, and that one day reality itself might speak up on our behalf. This movie takes that dream, gives it oceanic force, wraps it in myth, and sends it crashing through the walls of class, shame, and imposed weakness. It is not flawless, but it is memorable, it is emotionally keyed in, and when it locks into its strengths, it absolutely roars. If you love stories where the hero rises from the bottom not by becoming fake or flashy but by uncovering what was always there, you're going to have a very good time with this one. If you love fantasy with weight, symbolism, and a hero whose power feels tied to pain rather than disconnected from it, there is a lot here for you. And if you just want to see arrogant nobles laugh at a man with a rusty pitchfork right before the entire meaning of that image turns against them, trust me, this movie knows exactly how to feed that hunger. It gives you the setup, it stretches the tension. And when the answer comes, it comes like a wave that has been building far out at sea for years. That is the feeling One Move God Mode leaves you with. Not just the image of power, but the inevitability of it, the sense that something ancient, patient, and unstoppable has finally arrived. And honestly, that's the kind of cinematic energy I can respect all day. So if you've seen One Move God Mode, let me know what hit hardest for you. Was it Ethan's awakening, the trial itself, the class revenge angle, the Poseidon mythology, or that final sense that the road to Olympus is going to get even crazier from here? And if you haven't seen it yet, I'd say go in ready for a movie that wears its heart, its power fantasy, and its mythic symbolism openly, because when a film commits this hard, the best thing you can do is meet it with the same openness. If you enjoyed this review, make sure you like the video, subscribe to Bongo Gaming, turn on the bell so you don't miss the next deep dive, and drop your own rating in the comments. Thanks for listening, thanks for being here, and until the next one, stay safe, stay legendary, and I'll see you in the next video.